everybody, both in person and virtually. Thank you all for joining us today for the GBO Colloquium Series. It is my pleasure to introduce you all to our guest speaker for the day, Rafe Pomerance. Now, Rafe is quite prestigious, I have to say. He started out as president of the Friends of the Earth organization. He has been the Deputy Assistant Secretary for of the State for Environment and Development during the Clinton administration. He's the founder and president of the Climate Policy Center, as well as chairman of the organization Arctic 21. And most recently, founder and chairman of the board of American Rivers. He is currently a senior Arctic policy fellow and consultant of Rethink Energy Florida. And today we have him talking to us about his work on climate change and advocacy. So please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Right, thank you.
Also, if there are any questions, we will have time at the end of the talk. And if there are any questions with our online group, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hands and we will get to you.
Well, good afternoon. This afternoon. Great to be here. Let me say a word about myself. Geographically, I'm delighted that my wife Lenore is here with me. We're your neighbors. We live an hour north in Seneca Rocks. Yeah. And we have a place up there that was a kind of a second home or weekend place until COVID, and then it became our residence. So having the Green Bank Observatory here is one of the great assets of being there. You should only come this way more often. I'm a big fan. I've been in the exhibition center several times over the years. And so I just, in this setting here is so amazing, you know, the mountains and the valley, just great to come down. So my pleasure to be here. I was greeted by hosts here. We had quite a discussion. You know, I don't get to talk to astronomers much at all. I should say, I have a bachelor's degree in history. That's my academic background. I studied history, economics, politics. Turned out to be not such a bad education for working on climate change. Okay, and I'll describe some of my career. That background was actually helpful along the way. But one thing that came up in our early discussion, as I asked various questions of my host astronomers, well, let's talk about the solar system and a little bit. We went. I'll mention the other topic, one of many, but Venus, right? Venus has a super greenhouse effect, too much carbon dioxide, nobody lives there. Well, it turns out one of the most famous scientists in climate change, Jim Hansen, you probably all heard of him. He was started out at, I think, the University of Iowa. He was a planetary scientist, and then he moved into modeling the Earth and became head of the NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York. And that's where I first met him, because one of my stories is how I went up there to recruit him or to listen to him, and then recruiting him to become a congressional witness in the early stages of this. But so we got onto Venus, and he used to talk about Venus in the early talks, and it occurs to me that with the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, I realize that we might be using the Venus analogy a little more as we continue to allow CO2 levels to rise. Not that we're going to be Venus, but it kind of points out to people what's at stake. our other story came at the end. The story, which I never knew, is that what's the Earth composed of? And, you know, it's all this material that came from exploding stars, right? Well, what did I know? That our rocks up in Seneca Rocks, I thought, oh, these are very old, 400 million years, whatever. Not so, right? They haven't. Anyway, this is the privilege of coming down here. You hear things you just don't ever heard of. Okay, so I want to bring you, and I'll come back to this toward the end, a new initiative that I'm working on. Now, I've been at this. I did just the arithmetic. This is year 44 for me of working on climate change. And, but I wanted to bring you something fresh, as well as a bit of description of my work. And that initiative, we'll come back to this, is for this, and this can apply at any state, local, global level. And my colleagues in Florida and I have been working on this initiative for a while. And we are calling on the state of Florida to establish an upper limit to sea level rise. You may know that in the Paris Accord on climate change, the upper limit was sort of focused on how much temperature increase we should allow the Earth, how hot should it get? And there are sort of two goals, 2 degrees, or better yet, 1.5 degrees centigrade. And that's all people know. That's the only quantitative limit as a result of the warming of the planet that's out there. Okay? Nothing else sets limits for politicians. I mean, it's all in the models and the assessments, all that, but there's no kind of politically agreed number. So we're calling on Florida to set its own upper limit. It can't achieve it itself. It has to be global. But Florida's viability is at stake from, among other climate impacts, sea level rise, and they're already dealing with the impacts there. And so, well, let's come back to that. That's new. You've never heard of this? You know, we're selling it. It's in the very early stage of trying to sell this idea. So, as I mentioned, I'm in my 5th decade. I'll tell you a little bit of how it began. And if you want to read the details of it, there was a full, just to say, this is not nothing. There was the entire issue of the New York Times Magazine was devoted to this period, and it was called Losing Earth. Has anybody read it? One. Okay, we have homework here. Losing Earth, easy, find it on the web. It's a really good piece. It was the entire issue, and it was really good because a lot of it was about me. So I think you guys written by a guy named Nathaniel Rich. And the photos in it, the New York Times came out and took photos of Lenore and me and our family, who were there at the time, out here in Seneca Rocks. So if you look at the back of the web version, there's some photos from Seneca Rocks. Anyway, then that article summarizes kind of like the first 10 years of work on this, and I was involved in much of it. So when I started, I like to say, climate change was an empty room. This room, there would be nobody in it. Nobody knew anything. Nobody was talking about it. I mean, maybe some astronomers knew something about it, but it was not a public issue. Even the scientists who work on the problem weren't particularly public about it. There was no focus at any level of government other than a small research program in the Department of Energy. And so here I spent 5 years from 73 to 77 working on amendments to the Clean Air Act as a lobbyist. Okay, we had a coalition called the National Clean Air Coalition. And in that time, now this is where my history background is done. Should I have known better? Should I have known something about carbon dioxide? It was never discussed in 5 years of congressional action on the Clean Air Act from 73 to 77. So nothing, room was empty. So what happened then is that I'm working on acid rain after, because we didn't really address acid rain in the amendments. We began to have a discussion, but really the Clean Air Act was not written to control regional emissions of sulfur dioxide and NOx and something. It's all local. But acid rain is kind of a regional emissions problem. So I began to study the acid rain problem. You know, we had dead lake issues in the Northeast in Canada. So I'm reading this EPA report and I come across a sentence in it. So it's on the environmental impacts of coal, an obscure report. I'm reading it in my office. And I come across a sentence that says, coal use will warm up the earth, or could. And I was shocked at reading this. What? You mean we're going to warm up the earth? This is 1979. And so I hollered, and it made this, the New York Times, this is the whole banana. That's what I said out loud. And fortunately, I said that because one of my colleagues came in, a woman named Betsy Ago, who worked with me on Clean Air Act, and she then the next day brought in an article from the Rocky Mountain News that summarized the talk given by a geophysicist named Gordon MacDonald. Maybe somebody saw Gordon, but he was a pretty famous geophysicist, youngest guy ever elected to the National Academy, was on Nixon's first Council on Environmental Quality. He had been leading a panel of the Jasons the previous summer, Jasons being top physicists across the country, to model double CO2, okay? The double C, that's the standard practice. You model a doubling of the concentration and see what happens to our planet. And this article referred to Gordon's talk and spelled it out. So turns out he was a scientist out on the Beltway, the MITRE Corporation. And I called him up and I said, I was at Friends of the Earth at the time. I called him up, I said, will you talk to me? Explain this to me. And fortunately, he was a very outgoing, communicative, wonderful character. And and happily willing to explain it to me. And I went out there to see him. And we spent 2 hours and together. He explained it all. He had a famous move he used to make with his hand. It would go like this to reflect sort of the Mauna Loa monitoring of carbon dioxide. It goes right up in the winter, down in the summer, as the trees, the world of biology sucks up carbon dioxide, so it lowers it a little bit. And okay, I said to Gordon, if I set up the briefings, will you do them? Being that I was a lobbyist, you know, I knew how to do that. And I thought, well, this issue has to get out there. So that's sort of how we exited the empty room and began to talk about this in Washington circles. And we briefed a whole lot of people in the Carter administration, on Capitol Hill, in the media, and to tell you how this issue was treated back then. One of the people we talked to was a reporter I knew very well named Phil Shabakov, who was the environmental writer for the New York Times. So we go brief Phil. He's very patient with us, takes it all in, and he writes an article. So where does this article on the fate of the Earth appear? Page B29 on Saturday. Well, if you want an article to be buried, that's where you put it. I'm not accusing him of a conspiracy. I'm just saying nobody knew anything. So among the people, Gordon, we briefed the president's science advisor back then. He knew Gordon, so he trots out his whole key staff. Gordon does the briefing, and he calls up the president of the National Academy and says, we've got to have a panel on this. We've got to do a panel on climate change. And the guy they picked to run it was Jules Charney, who was at the big lab up at Princeton. Well, I can't remember now. But anyway, Jules Charney ran this panel, famous panel, Charney report. What they conclude, you've heard of it? Yes? Oh, excellent. They basically conclude that doubling CO2 means that the global temperature will increase on average 3 degrees C plus or minus a degree and a half. And that conclusion, the conclusions today aren't that different. And that was sort of the same conclusion that Gordon's Jason modeling came up with. But that because it was in the National Academy, it got a lot more attention, legitimized interest in the issue that began to bubble up. So there's briefing. Another person we briefed who was a friend and became even a better friend was a fellow named Gus Speck. And Gus was the chairman of Carter's Council on Environmental Quality. And Gus says to Gordon, listen, Gordon, I want to do something about this. but I can't do it without a report. So Gordon goes off and writes a report with 3 other scientists, very prominent. George Woodwell, founder of the Woodwell Climate Research Center, Roger Revelle, very famous oceanographer, and David Keeling, who the guy who invented the Keeling Observatory on Mauna Loa and the famous Keeling curve. So in a very short time, they produced a report for Gus Speth, and he proceeds to begin to educate the Carter administration. So just to say, these briefings were the beginning of the process. So I'm going to just jump ahead. And it turns out the key for me, it's like coming here. You want to find things out? You go talk to the scientists. You talk, you learn something, and you say, are you willing to come forward and speak? So that's what happened. Hansen had a big paper written in Science magazine, his modeling results. I went up to New York to see him. He was willing to see me. We talked for a long time. I say, okay, Dr. Hansen, are you willing to be a congressional witness? You have a big story to tell. You know, you got to get out of here and come down to Washington and tell the story. And he said, yes. Well, that turned out to be an important conversation, because Hansen then becomes a star witness in the Congress, because he was very courageous to put out, you know, some of the truth about what was at stake. All right, so that in turn, this is good. The clock is right there. I got to move along with the clock here. So next phase I want to touch on are the key congressional hearings. All right. So I moved from Friends of the Earth to the World Resources Institute, which happened to be run by Gus Speth, fellow I just mentioned. He founded it. I think in part his motivation came from, you know, he had a kind of global view, and climate change became a core part of that organization. And I went to work for him to try to continue the work to put this on the national global agenda. And one story after a very good hearing that we got going in '85, the guy, his staff guy, Curtis Moore, who was running, he said, Rafe, you need a horse. My senator who chaired this hearing, his name was David Durenberger, he won't be your horse. You need a different horse. John Chafee from Rhode Island is having a meeting. I don't know if these names mean anything to you, but there's some heroes here, okay? Historic figures. Chafee's having a meeting with the environmental community to decide what his agenda was. He chaired a committee, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee on Environmental Pollution. He had a big post. Chafee was a liberal environmental Republican. And so I say to Gus, we got to go to this briefing with the environment. Curtis says, go to the briefing, talk to Chafee, make it happen. So we do that. I get Gus and I accompany him to this meeting. And Gus, who's the president of our organization, Senator, you got to do this. Here's what it is, climate change. Chafee says, I'll do it. Boom, like that. That's how it goes, right? And I then went to work with Chafee's staff, a guy named Steve Schimberg, who's still a friend. And we organized this hearing, June 10th and 11th, 1986. Yeah, I remember the dates because it was a big deal. I think it's a big deal. And every anniversary, I try to remind people it's a big deal. Because the witness list that we put together made front page headlines in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And this was Chafee, and we wrote into Chafee's opening statement, says, I'm here to learn about this. He said, I'm announcing 6 initiatives. Well, he jumped sort of to trying to move the ball forward, okay? And so maybe I could say that those headlines began to fill the room that I started to say was empty, okay? And it led to then a series of hearings in 86, 87, and 88. I'll just touch on one other. Well, let me say a couple characteristics of the 86 hearing. The first witness was Bob Watson, who was a NASA stratospheric chemist, okay? And at that time, the world scientists were observing a hole the size of North America in the ozone layer, centered over Antarctica. Remember the ozone hole? Okay, good. So Watson gets up there and puts this satellite movie of the observations up on the screen for all the senators so they can see the whole, the satellite version. And what that does is convince people that human beings can alter things on a grand scale. We're big players, or at least we didn't understand the ozone hole so well then, but it was new. It was obvious that some human intervention was doing this. So Watson and the NASA team, they go down to Antarctica, they fly a mission through the stratosphere, and they pick up the key chemical, like looking for chemicals in the universe, right? They were down, that I picked up today, right? So, and they find the key chemical, chlorine monoxide, which tells them that chlorofluorocarbons, what we use for coolants, were, as the chemical rises in the atmosphere, it breaks up and the chlorine reacts with the ozone and destroys the ozone, which means that a lot more ultraviolet radiation strikes the earth because the ozone blocked the ultraviolet radiation. So that was a big finding to move the system along. Okay, the second witness was Sherry Rowland at that hearing. Nobel Prize winner on the ozone issue. We coupled the issues, which was a good thing to do because the ozone hole legitimized thinking about a greenhouse effect. And Sherry Rowland, the one-liner from the hearing was the Senator Chafee leans back in his chair and his question is, Senator Rowland, if you were king, what would you do? Having heard the story of what we're doing to our atmosphere, right? Rowland, who was without missing beat, Senator, I'd ask the Queen. He turns around and his wife is right behind me. Some people don't like it, some people like it, but I can't help myself. Okay, 88, another hearing. Senator Tim Wirth from Colorado. He was somebody we had briefed, he's a friend, he's really interested in this, and he had done a hearing in 87 as a result of our briefing his chairman, Bennett Johnston, and Wirth walks out of a meeting from the Stockholm Environmental Institute up on the hill, Capitol Hill. He says, I want to do a hearing. This is like the summer of 88, right? I want to do a hearing. Does he know what it's about? No. So I suggested his staff person, David Harwood, why don't you call Hansen up? Hansen already testified. And he said, ask him what he wants to say. So he calls up Hansen, and Hansen tells him, here's what I'll say. That we have now observed sufficient warming to declare that the Earth's temperature is outside natural variability. This was a very big deal. Everybody thinks that 88 hearing was the event. So Hansen goes, the country's in drought, it's hot, perfect timing. He goes up and says, it's time to say that humans have pushed the Earth outside natural variability. They keep very close temperature record up at the NASA, Goddard Institute for Space Studies. So they could detect how the global average temperature was moving away from natural variability as expected. Well, this was a bombshell. It was huge. And Hansen got beat up by a lot of his colleagues, but he's a brave guy. He stuck to it and he turned out to be right. And that testimony sort of that hearing is referred to time and again, the 88 hearings that sort of broke things loose. Well, that then led to a process in the international community, the founding, there were a lot of steps, but the founding of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the international assessment body, to look at the science and impacts and then advise the international community what to do. Now, I remember the founding, I went to the first meeting and I remember I was on a Swiss Air flight, I think it was Swiss Air, to Geneva where it was. And it was the night of the Dukakis-Bush election. So I'm sitting there saying I'm a Democrat, I confess. I said, Dukakis wins, I'll become head of our delegation in Geneva. Ridiculous idea, but that was one of my fantasies. Of course, the pilot comes on and says that Bush won, HW, right? So The IPCC was founded, a lot of great work on the science, the impacts, policy responses, and to this day, I think they've done half a dozen major assessments every 5 years. They are not quite all science because governments have the final say-so on the wording. So you got the Saudis in the room, you know, the Russians. I don't know if they'll still be in the room next time, but you know, the US, countries with different interests. So you have to produce this consensus, despite the fact that the diplomats who are approving it have some certain interests. They're trying to make sure they're taken care of without overly distorting the assessment. And this assessment was based on another assessment process, which was in existence already on the ozone layer. Okay? And the international body that did the assessments of the ozone layer. So let me move on. Now we're 1989. Bush. There was another hearing. Hansen is testifying before Al Gore, former vice president, climate guy, and he runs a subcommittee in the Senate. And Hansen's testimony is altered by OMB, the Office of Management Budget. They changed the conclusions. Not good when you do that to Jim Hansen's testimony. So he gets up there in front of Gore and says, they changed the testimony. Oh, big news, big news. Okay, to try to downplay it. You know, there were a lot of different voices in the Bush administration, fortunately. There was John Sununu, the chief of staff, was a skeptic, denialist. Was Bill Riley, environmentalist, advocate at EPA. So what happens? It happened to be the week that inside the Bush administration, they were that's deciding whether to go forward with a global negotiation. Okay, to negotiate a treaty on climate change, like there was on the ozone. And that testimony had sent waves down to the White House that helped sort of turn the decision to, yes, we're going to negotiate that treaty. And that negotiation became what's known as the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which to this day is the governing instrument of global negotiations. So, and it was signed, the famous meeting in Rio in 1992. Bush went down to sign the Rio Treaty. And it was like a 3-year negotiating process. Of course, you know, many volumes have been written on it. It's a long story. But essentially, they agreed that there was a serious problem. We should do something about it, but without spelling out much at all of what they would do. That was the deep political deal. That treaty, imagine this, not that you guys spend a lot of time worrying about what they're doing in the Senate on treaties, but that treaty, which was forwarded by the Bush administration for the Senate's advice and consent, which must be given for the US to join a treaty, and requires a 2/3 vote of the Senate, got a unanimous vote. Can you believe that? Think about that today. Impossible. Impossible. And I mean, the White House, which was a Republican-led White House, acknowledged the issue, had to, and supported the final negotiation without very specific commitments on what to do about emissions. Now, you can argue this 2 ways. You can say, oh, they screwed it. No commitments to emissions. But they got a unanimous vote of the Senate, which the other side, the coal and oil industries were not going to oppose something that didn't really commit them that much, and was supported by one of their own, George H.W. Bush. So there was a famous interview with him, I don't know how famous, on Dutch TV, where the correspondent asked, well, why, President Bush, don't you do more about climate change? And he says, I can't find this tape, but I didn't make it up. He said, what? The oil industry gives us all our money. I mean, he said that to the interviewer. Okay. But nevertheless, they negotiated a treaty, and to this day, that's the treaty under which the Paris Accord was negotiated, which set the 1.5 and 2 degree limits Okay, so just a few, I joined the State Department after that. And became a climate negotiator, and I joke with my friends now, I say, did you know that I was the head of the US delegation for the first 10 days of COP1? Well, this was COP27. We just added one number, 1 year, right? So 27 or 29 years ago, I led the US delegation for the first part of this negotiation in Berlin. I think it's kind of amusing, but whatever. And we went on then to propose in the Clinton Gore administration a new treaty that had more teeth, became known as the Kyoto Protocol. And when George Bush Jr., whatever, George W. won the election, he threw out the Kyoto Treaty, which actually prompted the rest of the world to ratify it. And the treaty came into force because Bush said no. I mean, it was that dynamic. Okay. Just to say, when Clinton took over, one of the central proposals that he and Gore made early on was a BTU tax, if anybody remembers. They proposed a BTU tax. Well, why a BTU tax? It's an energy tax, but it really is a disguised carbon tax, okay? It almost matches the carbon, BTUs almost match the carbon content of fuels. So if you're going to tax BTUs, you're also taxing carbon, the source of carbon dioxide, right? And economists will all tell us the best, most efficient way to cut carbon dioxide is with a tax. We know that. Cheap, efficient, all-encompassing. What they didn't analyze is the politics of it. And the tax didn't go very far in Congress. I think it passed the House, or a version of it, never passed the Senate, and was used by the Republicans in the following congressional election to beat up the Democrats. And the same thing happened in the Obama administration. The first thing they come out with is a cap and trade program on carbon, which acts like a tax. I won't go into it all, but it goes down, doesn't happen, and is used in the following congressional election to pound those who voted for it. Okay, I want to touch on a few issues that I've been involved with since then. One thing I did at State, we launched something called the Coral Reef Initiative. Anybody notice? I know up here, Green Bank, we don't pay a lot of attention maybe to coral reefs. Maybe you do on vacation. The problem that was showing up then, an early signal, was that coral was bleaching. The ocean was already too hot, and the coral were bleaching and dying. And we launched an initiative in the State Department, which still exists, called the International Coral Reef Initiative. That became a global initiative to track, among other things, the bleaching of coral. And now, because of scientific observations, we know that this is a global phenomenon. A high percentage of the reefs in the world are dead from bleaching. So you want a climate signal? There it is. Don't need anything else. Very early, very catastrophic, very powerful. Does anybody pay attention? Oh, scientists, users of the reefs. Anyway, but it's still going. But it's actually useful to refer to it as an early signal. You don't think this is happening? Explain that. Okay, next. I want to touch on, mention the tax proposal, okay? ARCA-E. During the Bush, after the Clinton years, one of the things that the National Academy of Sciences proposed was an effort, one of the components of climate policy is to revolutionize technology, to cut the cost of cheap substitute technology that doesn't produce carbon dioxide, that's benign, clean, green, whatever. And what you want to do, like they do in the Pentagon, which has a huge effort called DARPA. Maybe some DARPA money comes here, I don't know. But that's a Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Well, this is modeled on that. It's called Advanced Research Projects Administration Energy. And this entity was set up. We lobbied the Congress to get it done. I was involved in that, and it now exists. And it's a several $100 million a year operation to fund radical research on breakthrough technology. That was a plus, and Bush signed it. He didn't fund it, Obama funded it, but it's going. Another thing we did with my organization at the time, which one it was, Climate Policy Center. We got some hearings going in the Congress on geoengineering. That's a good topic for Green Bank, you know. The geoengineering, a simple version means you put sulfates in the stratosphere to reflect sunlight back to space, like a volcano, like El Nino. No.
That's not gonna
I'm
help.
gonna forget that went off in the Philippines in '91. Thank you. I need help. Memory, you know. Anyway, Pinatubo cooled the Earth substantially for a short period of time while those sulfates remained in the stratosphere and then drop out. So the model, one of the major ideas, is to imitate Pinatubo, drive down the temperature of the Earth in the short run. We got some hearings going. This is a very difficult issue. Lots of opposition, scientists, environmentalists. I'm just saying it's out there. There's more work being done on it because people continue to conclude that we're too far gone. Things have just gotten too hot and they're going to get a lot hotter. What are we going to do? Okay. Venus. I want to go there. So another element of work has been in Florida. For 30 years, I've been working down there with Floridians to try to help them and us raise the visibility to climate impacts, because Florida is so vulnerable that if they ever figured it out, there might be a transformation of the politics of the whole issue. Florida's viability is at stake. We start to lose the Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica, rapid decrease in the size. Greenland's got 7 meters. Thwaites has a meter, almost a meter. Antarctica has. Florida's viability, I think in the paleoclimate evidence, you know, Florida barely exists. So, you know, my wife, Lenore, and I were just down. We had a 2-week break in Miami Beach. You want to see vulnerability? There it is. It was good to go down there and just look at those condos that are like that much above sea level. Okay, so I spent a lot of time. I remember I gave a speech down there about a month and a half ago on this new idea. And we found a declaration that we worked on back then with Governor Love Childs, if you ever remember him. This was a declaration written in like '91 on climate change in Florida, more than 30 years ago. Wake up! And now what do? And this is not a political comment. We have had 3 leaders of Florida who could have turned this around, who take the position as denialists. You can figure, should I mention names? Including the current governor, former president, and the man who was the chairman of the Republican Senate Campaign Committee, who was governor and never permitted the use of the words climate change in his administration. Okay, but so Florida has been a long-standing issue or a possibility, and there's a lot going on down there. There are regional compacts of multiple counties, like in South Florida, Southeast Florida compact from Monroe, the Keys, all the way to Palm Beach. They all work together because they all got the same problem: rising ocean. It's already risen a foot. There's blue sky flooding. They've got a lot of money they have to spend to accommodate it, and it will only grow over time. And that's where our initiative comes in. Then along comes the Paris Agreement, which establishes these quantitative goals, 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade. Big deal, just that nobody quite knows what they mean. I mean, it's hard to translate 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade to the public. That then leads to this, jumping ahead here, what I just mentioned. Here in West Virginia now, I look up on a website, all kinds of transition projects going on for clean energy. A lot of money being spent, a lot of solar being put into place, even carbon sequestration. There's movement here. And that's important because a state like West Virginia, which is coal dominated, plays a big role in the politics of all this. Witness the early stages in the Build Back Better legislation and role of Joe Manchin. Because coal is a political force, but it's changing. The demand for coal is dropping, and there's a lot of new employment coming in the state on clean energy. Okay, and then on top of that, you have the Inflation Reduction Act, which has hundreds of millions of dollars in incentives for clean energy. That was a byproduct of the last Congress. Okay, that's it, right up to today, except for this new initiative, the upper limit for sea level rise. Well, what will that do? Our idea is that if the world, or Florida, or West Virginia, doesn't need to do that, but established an upper limit, then political leaders would have to debate how high can we go? How high can we let sea level rise? It would be a debate. It's like a debate over temperature, except you'd be debating over sea level rise, which is something everybody understands. And all of a sudden, the world would see the losers, small island states, coastal zones, Bangladesh, Indonesia, the Southeast United States, all over the world has coastal zones, right? So it would make transparent the impact of a warming planet. And then it would motivate policymakers to act. That's the point. And I gave a speech down in Florida the other day about this. I'm working with my colleagues at Rethink Energy. Speech went very well. There's an accompanying op-ed. There's a video speech. Anyway, we're beginning to sell it. I can't say that it has been adopted by Governor DeSantis yet, but we hope. So, but this idea, the question, what you think of it, I think it can change the whole debate, because if the world said, oh, we got to agree to 2 feet, that's too much, man, all hell would break loose. I mean, it would begin to understand what's at stake here in a much more transparent way. So that's the idea of the upper limit. And, you know, I'm working on it from Seneca Rocks. Lenore and I discussed it. We've got some, I forgot to bring my brochures down here next time. And that's up to date. So questions, comments, anything you like.
So if there are questions here, go ahead and start with Jay.
What is today's equivalent of what the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post were in the 70s?
Well, the front page equivalent on climate change?
Anything.
Anything. Oh,
When you talk about making a splash on the front page, what's the equivalent media today?
You understand the question.
as I can. You know, is it January 6th? That January 6th, to me, that got a lot of sustained attention. It's sort of like, well, the front page we got then was a breakout, you know, it was new scientific information. And I'm stumped. It's gonna take me a while.
Well, what do you think?
No, I don't understand. I mean, I grew up at that time and read most of the Times every day, still do, but that's not the same impact. I'm not sure if anything has the same impact.
Well, there have been, I mean, what would happen in the tragedy of Memphis? Is that, you know, that is driving changes in policy. There are events like that you know, have brought gun safety to the fore. I think there are a lot of them, you know. How about, you know, I think a lot of the January 6th stuff, the election denialism has been big, and those are continuing stories, whereas climate change is episodic. It comes and goes, comes and goes.
I guess the question then is also, can you control any of that? How can you ensure the next big story is pushing these issues of climate change?
Well,
We have-
it went from that empty room way back 44 years ago. There are now millions of people involved. And they are pushing it all the time in different ways. There are just too many initiatives to follow or track, but you know, when Joe Biden ran for president, climate change was one of his 4 issues, right? Big issue. Well, that's the first time that any presidential candidate has surfaced the issue in such a sustained way, and they do that. They don't do that out of the blue. They look at their polling data and see what issues. No, you got to confirm that it's relevant. And I mean, I think that Biden certainly had that instinct, and I actually worked with him on foreign relations to produce the first piece of climate legislation. And just remember that. I went up with Ryan, that's another story.
Yeah, it depends where you are. In California, it's fires, it's drought, it's rain, and so those papers, not everybody reads it close to the top, but, and the water issue in the West.
Go ahead, Jim.
So your optimism is infectious, and I applaud your work. But is it justified? We are in a society now where, if the gas prices go up, it's a political disaster. Maybe the gas prices going up is exactly what we need to wean us off this. So can you just speculate how the next 10 years will play out in this field? Can we get to clean energy before we bake?
How baked do you think we? I would say partially baked already. Partially, and we're going to get more baking before it stops. Now the question is, can we stop it? And I would say most estimates are that we're going to hit 2 degrees, which is catastrophic in many ways. So I think we got, we've got a lot of pain ahead of us that we're going to have to respond to. Can society respond sufficiently fast? Well, one element of that, and we've got a lot more than we used to, is the cost of substitute technology. That's a real advance. Solar, wind, even carbon sequestration, carbon removal, and the Inflation Reduction Act is a big contributor to momentum. The problem is, we're at 420 some odd parts per million CO2. We're more than 50% above the pre-industrial average. Plus, I don't know, methane is double or triple pre-industrial, which is another greenhouse gas. So we have committed the Earth to a big warming already. So can we turn that around? Well, that's why there's a debate about geoengineering. That's why there are people in this terrible tragedy in outside Atlanta, people trying to hold that forest from being cut down. So I think we're in trouble. And this guy, that's why being here is so interesting. Saying, well, have you found any other civilization that's in such trouble out there in the universe? What did they do? I mean, it's kind of interesting to be here and have the perspective of, I know what it was, right? Look back at the Earth. What dummies did this to the Earth? Look at Venus, look at what we're doing now. It says that human species, Homo sapiens don't have all the right instincts. And so, but there's a lot of momentum out there. Who knows how fast it can go? The trouble is this, I go back and forth, don't have waffles, but this is the largest transformation ever required on the planet that's conscious to change the energy system of planet Earth. That requires everybody to play in a big way. Like in nuclear weapons, which will destroy us, but they require restraint or elimination, but they don't require the action of the entire 8-9 billion people. Good question.
So I'm asking younger people, the young people who are here, of you, what your perspective is. Because we're not going to be, I don't know what to do. And 20 years, we're not going to be here.
So you're asking, what is the younger generation's perspective on.
Well, yeah, but
the
you
issue.
feel it, you know, you're 10 years. Okay,
So
I'm
I'm
looking at you.
Yeah, I had a question, so I'm changing my question after Jim asked that. I guess I'm feeling rather pessimistic. It seems like we've kind of done a lot of damage already. Are there things that you know of? I probably can Google this, but, are there things that we can do to damage control? Like you're talking about the geoengineering of, putting sulfates up in the atmosphere and things. You think we will be able to develop things to mitigate some of the issues? So I guess I'm rather pessimistic and trying to look forward to what can we do. Create.
And it's,
That's,
it's the world that we're leaving you.
yeah. So are there things that?
Well, there is a research program on geoengineering in effect being considered. There was legislation that got through the Hill telling the administration to conduct a open process to talk about a research program. And that was a political advance in the sense that nobody killed it. What happened, if you go back to the Obama years, John Holdren, who was the president's science advisor, was asked early on by a reporter, well, Mr. Advisor, you support geoengineering research. Holdren says, of course. That was the last moment of the mention of that issue because he got killed for saying that. It was very unpopular because people think, oh, if you do this, you won't do the emissions part. So I would say there's some colleagues, you know, people have put together comprehensive packages of everything you have to do to bring things back. Everything. Emission reductions, carbon removal from the atmosphere, geoengineering, then there are something called marine cloud brightening, where you put salt particles in marine clouds to increase the reflectivity. So there are a variety of schemes, but the best analysis to me is the comprehensive analysis, and which says there's several parts to the strategy: the emission reductions, carbon removal from the atmosphere, carbon sequestration in the biological world, examining the possibilities of geoengineering and intervention. And there are more, but you've got to do them all simultaneously. And, you know, just my mind goes to the war in Ukraine. How do you do this on a global scale with something like that? When Putin, Siberia is melting under his feet. The permafrost is melting, which caused great damage across most of Russia to the infrastructure, and ends up releasing massive amount of carbon dioxide, or will, from the soils. There was a question back. Pardon?
I'm worried this is gonna be a stupid question. Is all the laying of asphalt a problem with global warming, of taking away green spaces and, in cities? Does that contribute at all?
Right, so is laying asphalt and replacing what would normally be green areas with non-green areas a significant factor?
Well, fortunately, you turned the question into something I can answer. I thought I was going somewhere else, but I think the answer is yes. The more, well, two things. If you cover an area of asphalt, if you cover a lighter color surface with a dark surface, which absorbs more energy instead of reflecting it, so you diminish the Earth's reflective capacity. If you cut trees and burn them up, you release the carbon in those trees to the atmosphere. In addition, the more roads you build, the more traffic you generate, which means there's more emissions from the transport sector. And the construction process itself, depending on the asphalt, you know, the limestone and all, construction process can be very carbon intensive. So there are a lot of ways where that's the case. So, and of course, the asphalt has its environmental impacts in terms of runoff, streams. So not a stupid question at all. Good question. Thank you.
All right, we have a few more questions here. And if there are any other questions online, please feel free to raise your hand. But yes, let's go with Angela in the back.
So I, just a little context, I'm an educator, not a scientist. But I feel like my generation and my parents' generation, the real battle was in convincing folks that climate change was a real problem that needed to be addressed. It's an argument about it. I feel like with the youth that I work with now, they're fully on board. It's not any longer a conversation about whether this is happening. It's a question of what to do about it. And there's a lot of sense of just being overwhelmed, and that it's a fuel battle and there's no way to win. And so I'm just curious, like it's such a complex problem, they don't know which way to look. And so if you were talking to a young person, I don't know, it has to be one thing, but where do we focus? What's going to be the most impactful thing in terms of the action that we take now? It's a place, maybe not the one thing to do, but as a starting point for a young person who really cares and wants to make it.
Oh, I don't know. Well, there's no right answer. Take a look at your own house. How efficient is it? What can you do to make your house less carbon intensive? How do you burn less propane or whatever? Do you have a heat pump? I mean, we've gone through this stuff. So you can do a home inventory, energy inventories of your house. I mean, that's something people could do right at home. And what about how is their transportation budget? Where do they live? Can they diminish their vehicle miles traveled in some way? I mean, you can pick fairly simple pieces where they start small and can accomplish something, which might give them greater appetite for doing bigger things. But to sit down with their local officials and say, hey, we're really worried about this. What are you doing and what should we do to help you? That kind of thing. I think there's a lot that is a manageable bite that the people can get into. Yeah. But that's one of the transformations that happened that young people came on board. What we suffered from, I'll just mention this, in the 1980s, the oil and coal industry sponsored a huge denialist disinformation campaign that to this day has had a huge negative effect. People don't believe in this. The fact that you have to say they're fully on board. Well, why wouldn't they be? Well, it's because of that very denialist campaign.
No, you're good. I think we have time for one more question. If you had one, Walter.
So one thing that I thought was kind of interesting about the source story was those initial reports from the EPA and so on understated the look they were. It seemed like the authors understood the impacts, but there's like a disconnect in sending that to environment. So I was just wondering, is there anything we're learning today that's new about climate change and the greenhouse effect that's kind of similarly overlooked? Like that.
Anything that's overlooked?
Or the most.
Well, I'll just like instantly think of the coral reef story, because the coral reefs are a tragedy. They're done. They're clear climate signal. They should tell everybody what's at stake in the biological world. I'm just instantly responding to you. That's out there. I mean, look what's happening in Antarctica. There's all this warm water coming up from lower elevations in the ocean that's been sitting there, being pushed up by a change in circumpolar winds, and it's because of climate change, changing the way the southern hemisphere works. And the warming of the water that's interacting with the ice of Antarctica is a threat to the entire coastal world, because if some of these big glaciers disintegrate, they raise sea level rise an enormous amount. Well, what the hell is going on in Antarctica? Do people know that? That's a big story. That's the future of many coastal worlds. Those could be examples.
Right. Well, thank you once again.
Thank you.
Rafe, for joining
Be
us.
here.
Give him one follow. Thank you very much, everyone online, for joining us for our colloquium today.